Most people, the only chemical they're aware of inside of cannabis is something called THC. That's the chemical that gives you a high from marijuana. But again, that's only one chemical out of dozens. And even the extraction of THC as an oil does have an effect on people, which is bringing medicinal qualities and healing to their lives. Well, we went to see them because their story has kind of become famous in the world of CBD. The Stanley brothers, a few years ago, began growing a strain of cannabis, specifically breeding out, if you will, the THC chemical compound, and instead breeding a strain of cannabis that essentially has a much higher level of CBD in it. And their goal was to treat cancer patients. Well, unbeknownst to them, they wound up treating a little girl through a kind of a series, a process. They treated a little girl who suffered from severe childhood epilepsy, having 300 seizures a day. And within a week of being treated with CBD oil, taking this oil, she was down to having something like only 8 seizures a week. It was absolutely incredible to see the transformation that took place. I mean, this little girl was so sick that her parents had to put her into a medically induced coma for fear that she would die from these seizures. So not only has her quality of life changed, but there are now tens of thousands of families who are moving to Colorado so their children can be treated. So we went to Colorado to talk to the Stanleys and to get an idea of what CBD was about, how it works, and people who are seeing effects from it. But, you know, don't kid yourself. I mean, there are people all over the world who are using CBD. It's not really just in Colorado, all over the world who are using the CBD compound, the CBD oil, to treat all kinds of sicknesses. Well, there are actually not near enough of those people who are doing it right now. What we're seeing is there are enormous backlogs of cancer patients, and again, people with Crohn's disease, children with epilepsy, who are on waiting lists to receive this CBD oil. There's not enough production going on to meet the demand right now, which of course makes the cost of the CBD oil much higher than it needs to be. There is an increase in production taking place here and in other countries around the world. Some of that CBD oil is being sent to the United States. Some of it, as in the form of cannabis, is coming here for medicinal purposes. But right now, the supply doesn't even come close to the demand for it. We interviewed a woman who was unrelated to the Stanley brothers, who actually began treating herself with CBD oil after watching an online documentary called Run from the Cure. It was by a guy named Rick Simpson living in Canada, who learned the process himself, was self-taught the process of extracting cannabis oil. And he created a YouTube video and taught people how to do it. And she lives in Kansas, saw the video and began this process of trying to extract her own oil. This woman was suffering from severe Crohn's disease to the point where she was literally, doctors were saying she was rotting from the inside out. Began taking CBD oil, just a tiny amount, a few drops a day. And within a few days, was no longer walking with a cane. And within a few weeks, her Crohn's disease had completely reversed itself. And so what's fascinating as we see this is the number of conditions that are being treated with it, because the key to it, and I'm not a scientist, but my understanding so far is that CBD and these cannabinoids actually have the ability to begin a regenerative process for the cells inside of your body. So for instance, when you're suffering from cancer, typically the process has been send someone in for chemotherapy, use radiation to kill all those bad cancer cells, and at the same time, you're killing all the good cells, which is why your hair falls out and you become so sick. In the case of CBD, the idea is that this cannabinoid actually has the ability to regenerate cells rather than killing off good cells. So it's really just fixing all the cells that are free radicals. I think that's the idea behind it. And what we're finding is there's this wide open frontier in terms of what it can do, what we're seeing in terms of treatment of patients, people with a variety of different diseases and sicknesses and ailments who are receiving real, true healing. This is not, fish oil. This is not snake oil. This is something that is truly bringing about relief to people who are dying of these ailments. There is scientific research that's being done right now. There are some case studies already that are demonstrating that CBD does have these properties that we're talking about. I know that some of the top biologists in the United States are working in California right now. Some of them are actually working secretly because THC is still illegal. And so they can't use these strains publicly, but they are secretly testing with THC and CBD kind of mixes in terms of the oil to get different results. Remember, everybody's body is different. And so when these cannabinoids are used and taken into the body, your process will be different than my process. However, what we're finding is that different levels of CBD, THC, CBA, CBN, all these different compounds inside of the cannabis plant have different effects on people. And some of these scientists, we, by the way, sent our video to one of these top biologists. He watched it and said, you're absolutely correct. And unfortunately, a lot of the research being done right now has to be done secretly for fear that government will come in, arrest the scientists who were involved in it, and confiscate their equipment. Yeah, so in the United States, marijuana, cannabis is considered a Schedule 1 drug. That ranking essentially means that it has no medicinal purposes whatsoever and has a very high rate of addiction. Neither of those things are true. Marijuana's rate of addiction is much lower than alcohol, much lower than even cigarettes here in the United States. So that part is patently false. But in addition to that, the claim that there's no medicinal purpose is what allows such high charges to be brought against somebody who's using this drug. And yet what we found through our research is that in 1999, so 15 years ago, the Department of Health and Human Services here in the United States filed for and obtained 2 different patents on CBD, cannabis as medicine, and specifically on CBD oil, cannabis oil, in the treatment of Crohn's disease, cancer, epilepsy, Alzheimer's. They hold a patent on it for 15 years. Now, again, keep in mind, the research that we're finding has only really been done over the last 4 or 5 years, where the public is beginning to understand the value of CBD oil and what it is. And yet our government has known and held a patent for 15 years while continuing to lock people up, even today, locking people up who would attempt to extract this oil or possess this oil for the treatment of their own bodies. So as much as this is a legal issue, it's also a moral issue. Why does government have the right to hold a patent on something that is a naturally occurring plant, claiming it's dangerous, but then owning that patent? And we've learned, by the way, since our story, they're actually leasing that patent out to a few pharmaceutical companies. There's a lot of debate in this country right now, especially over the role of government and what government should or should not be doing, what kind of power they should and should not have. And one of the big questions in that is the issue of patents. Should the federal government hold a patent over something, especially something like medicine, prevent people from being able to either replicate or use that medicine under the auspices of a patent? But at the same time, if you hold a patent on something which clearly states that it's has medical value, why in the world do you have a Department of Justice that is arresting people based on the idea that what they're using has no medical value? So even if we step away from the patent debate, and we could have a raging debate about whether or not government should actually own a patent or be able to, sell a patent or lease a patent in order to make income. But that aside, it still goes back to a schizophrenic policy, if you will, between government on one hand saying there is clearly medicinal value to CBD oil on one hand, and on the other hand saying, but if you use it, we're going to charge you as if you're using something that has no medicinal value. So those two things really are at odds with each other, and it's almost as if the left hand and the right hand don't know what the other is doing. The other thing that's important to remember is that when we talk about the issue of patents and people using this, there's a mother in the state of Minnesota here who took her son, teenage son, down to Colorado because he suffers from epilepsy and has these very violent seizures. She took him to Colorado. She got him treatment there. He was given CBD oil. His seizures, again, went from having hundreds in a week to having only a couple. He received, a little bit of this oil. His body was healing from it. He was doing much better. The family went back to Minnesota. When they came back to Minnesota, the mother was arrested. Her son put into Child Protective Services, and the mom was charged with giving her son an illegal substance and charged with child abuse. Now, this goes back to the issue of this policy that doesn't make any sense. How can government say it's medicine on one hand, let's patent it, and let's make money off that patent, but on the other hand, arrest a mother for using that medicine on her son, say it's child abuse to use it for his sake, even though it made him better? So the policies here don't make any sense at all, and I think that's where the real breaking point is going to be for people. So right now in the United States, we have two states, Colorado and Washington. They are the first 2 states to legalize marijuana for recreational use, which means you don't have to have a medical ID card. You don't have to have a prescription from a doctor in order to obtain it. There are a number of states where you have to have, a medical license in order to do that. In those two states, Colorado and Washington, you no longer have to have that. There are now bills pending in a multiple of other states, including in the state of Florida, where I think it's in 2 or 3 weeks, voters there will vote on whether or not to legalize marijuana for recreational use. So it would be a huge step forward for the state of Florida if they were to do so. And there are other states as well. South Carolina, which is a very conservative state in the United States, is right now considering a bill that would legalize CBD oil as medicine. So any family who has a child who is suffering from epilepsy, who has a family member who's suffering from cancer, would have the ability to obtain not the raw plant, the marijuana plant or cannabis plant, but they would be able to obtain CBD oil in order to treat an illness. So there are a number of states. Missouri, I think, is on that list. Utah is on that list. So there are a number of states that are moving in solely the CBD direction. There are other states that are moving more towards kind of a wider, broader use of marijuana and cannabis. In the states where they're going to legalize CBD oil, would they legalize you buying marijuana directly or cannabis directly and then extracting the oil? Probably not. And this is, again, where we start to run into some issues of cronyism, because you have lawmakers who say, well, we have to make sure it's done safely. And so it's got to be done through some pharmaceutical company or some, larger company that extracts the oil for you, because we can't trust you to do that yourself. I think there's going to be a continued debate over that and whether or not people have the right to extract for themselves. I'm hopeful that we'll continue to have that debate because, again, go back to the science of it. There's not a single case of a marijuana overdose in the history of the United States. There's never been one. We have 10,000 people a year who die from overdosing on prescription pills that they have a prescription for and are using correctly. So there is a debate that definitely needs to happen in that space. Right now, though, the climate in the United States is one where people aren't allowed really to do anything for themselves. Someone has to hold your hand at everything. So I don't think you'll be extracting for yourself in most of those states. Well, in the United States, part of our problem is that even in the states where it's been legalized, so in Washington and Colorado, recreational marijuana has been legalized, but it's still a federal crime. Now, that means the feds would still have the ability to raid marijuana shops, federal agents could still arrest people for using it. It's not legal federally, still considered a crime. So there are definitely issues with that when you have essentially competing jurisdictions, essentially arguing with each other over whether or not this should be legal or not. I think whether it's the United States or it's in Great Britain or wherever this is happening, this debate is happening, I think the debate has to hit the culture before it hits lawmakers. Most politicians are cowards. Most politicians are cowardly people in that they don't have a desire to go out and lead. They have a desire to kind of gauge where the public's interest is and lead from behind. And I think the way that you shift politicians and you shift the laws is to first shift the culture and present people with truth and fact, break down those overarching kind of archetypes that are built up in people's minds, the urban legends, break those, especially as media. I think we have a responsibility to do this. And when people begin to see there's real results from this, there are real people who are being healed by this, and there's real opportunity here. As the groundswell and the culture changes, the politicians will catch up, the laws will catch up, but the culture has to move first and the laws will come secondary. I don't think we can do it the other way around. My belief is that journalism is a very high calling, and our calling is to present people with truth. It is not to go out and to cover the latest scandal that's taking place or to shock the world with, the celebrity nude pictures that are out there. My belief is that as journalists, our job is to find truth and present it to people, because the reality is there is so much truth in our culture that's being suppressed right now. We are a truth deficient culture. And my goal is to present people with truth, even if that truth makes me uncomfortable. What's really interesting about this whole cannabis story is that, candidly, I'll share with you, I've never smoked marijuana in my life. I've never smoked a joint. I've never tried CBD oil. I've never had any contact with cannabis at all. But that has nothing to do with why I'm covering the story. I'm covering the story because It's an important story for people who are saying this is truly working. And for some reason, media won't talk about it. I mean, if you consider the results that they're seeing in Colorado, if you consider what's happening with these thousands, as I mentioned, thousands of families who are moving there that are called cannabis refugees, if you consider the people who are suffering from Crohn's disease and from Alzheimer's, who are actually seeing their bodies restored through the use of this oil, it should be front page news on every newspaper. It should be the lead of every newscast in the country. And yet there's barely even a blip about it. And that's beyond unfortunate to me. It's truly, it's immoral and it's wrong that media ignores things like this that can really change people's lives. So that's why we're covering these stories, is we really want to see people have their lives enriched as a result of our role as journalists.